תל אביב 360, ערוץ הפודקאסטים של אוניברסיטת תל אביב.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part D. The Untold Stories of the Kingdom of Israel. Chapter 4. The story that was told of the history of the kings of Israel and Judah, an introduction to the Book of Kings. The Book of Samuel describes a period of about a century between the days of Eli and Samuel and the days of David. The Book of Kings describes the history of the United Monarchy during Solomon's time and proceeds to the history of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah until after the destruction of the kingdom of Judah. This is a period of about 400 years between the middle of the 10th century and 560 BCE. The book of Samuel and the first two chapters of 1st King tells of the beginning of the monarchy of Israel, while the book of Kings, as it is named, describes the history of both Judah and Israel based on the stories of the kings who were placed at the center of the description. The Book of Kings has four main blocks. The first deals with the history of Solomon's reign. It includes 11 chapters, 1 King 1 to 11, the first two of which give the story of Solomon's ascension to the throne, while the others describe the very short period since, according to the Deuteronomistic closing formula on Solomon in 1 Kings 11 verse 42, the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Beside the chapters that glorify the character of Solomon in 1 Kings 3 and 4 and then 9 and 10, and the last chapter, 11, that describes the adversaries that God stripped up against him as a prelude to the division of the monarchy that would come after his days, this part of the Book of Kings centered on the description of the building of the temple and the king's palace. These are chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8. The second block of chapters in the Book of Kings begins immediately after the description of the division of the kingdom in chapter 12. Within it, 27 chapters from 1 King 13 to 2 King 17 are devoted to describing the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah side by side over a period of about 200 years. This block comprises over half of all the chapters of the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. Notable thus is the extensive space given to describing the history of the kingdom of Israel. However, of the 27 chapters in this block of the book, 12 and a half of the chapters are devoted to the description of the stories of two prophets, Elijah, this is in 1 Kings 17 and 18 and 19, and then 2 Kings 1, and Elisha in 2nd Books of Kings, chapter 2 to 9, and then 13 in verses 14 to 21. Hence, the block that describes the history of the kings in Israel and Judah includes 14 and a half chapters compared to the part that describes the two prophets, Elijah and Elisha, that, as mentioned, spans over 12 and a half chapters. Of course, one must ask whether this expresses a deliberate message from the Deuteronomistic historiography, whether it results from the sources available to the authors and editors of the book, or whether it was a combination of the two. We will address this question later. In any case, the last block in the Book of Kings includes 8 chapters, 2 Kings 18 to 25, describing the events of the kingdom of Judah alone, spanning from the destruction of the kingdom of Israel to the destruction of Judah, a period of exactly 134 years. The editorial framework of the Book of Kings is clear and is based on synchronisms, the matching of time periods between the reigns of kings of Israel and the reigns of the kings of Judah. Synchronizing the history of the kings is accomplished through the use of opening formulae and closing formulae for each king. For example, King Abiyam is introduced in first book of Kings, chapter 15, verses 1 and 2 as follows. Now, in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abiyam began to reign over Judah. He reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Ma'acha, the daughter of Abishalom. Such a synchronous opening formula, which later I will argue was based on a calculation by the Deuteronomistic editors, using the sources available to them, is applied in the beginning to the description of the reign of all kings. Thus, for example, King Asa is presented in the first book of Kings, chapter 15, verses 9 and 10, as follows. In the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Asa began to reign over Judah, and he reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Ma'acha, the daughter of Abishalom. Immediately after this opening formula, the description of the days of King Asa's reign is described in relative details. This is in verses 11 to 22. In the description of the days of Asa, King Baasha of Israel is mentioned, who had not yet been introduced through his own opening formula, since Asa reigned for 41 years and ascended in the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, who himself reigned for 22 years according to the first book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 20, after whom reigned his son Nadav for 2 years according to the first book of Kings, chapter 15, verse 25, before being murdered by Baasha, who eliminated the dynasty of Jeroboam and ascended the throne in the 3rd year of Asa's reign. He continued to rule over Israel for 24 years. This is according to the first book of Kings, chapter 15, verse 33. It follows from this that the technique for the Deuteronomistic authoring editors was to advance each time with a king or several kings in Judah, and then return and advance with a description of the reign of kings in Israel, when in each instance they mention, without other alternative, within the description of the reign of the kings in one kingdom, the kings who reigned contemporaneously in the other had to mention, until they move on to describe the history of the kings in the other kingdom, and then they introduce them with the orderly opening formula. The opening and closing formulae of each king have a fixed structure. The opening formulae include, apart from the synchronisms and the king's name, for example, in second book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 1, in the 2nd year of Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel, Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, began to reign. Also, it includes the age of the king, the length of his reign in years, and the name of his mother, a detail that is only mentioned for the kings of Judah. For example, in 2nd book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 2, he was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoadin of Jerusalem. On top of all these is a theological assessment formula. For example, in 2nd book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 3 and 4. And he did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, yet not like David his father. He did in all things as Joash his father had done. But the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. The ending formulae for each of the kings include a citation formula, which is a kind of bibliographic reference to the rest of the information about the king's history. For example, in 2nd book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 15. Now, the rest of the acts of Joash, which he did, and his might, and how he fought with Amaziah, king of Judah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the king of Israel? End of quote. The life stories of all the kings are locked in a formula that defines the death, burial, and inheritance if indeed there was a dynasty continuity. For example, in the second book of Kings, chapter 14, verse 16, and Jehoash slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel, and Jeroboam, his son, reigned in his stead. Through this form of description and the use of the opening and closing formulae, the description of the history of the kings of Israel and Judah are woven together. Clearly, this is the result of the Deuteronomistic editing work, through which the editors shaped the history according to their worldviews. As defined in the introduction chapter, the first Deuteronomistic editor from the time of Josiah summarized the history of the kingdom of Israel and Judah in a synchronous manner, with the kings themselves and not the kingdoms at the center of the story. The main idea that underlie the description are the concentration of cult in Jerusalem and the purification from foreign cult. At the center of the political, social, and cultic ideology of the Deuteronomist is the law of the Book of Deuteronomy, which offers the main criterion for evaluating the kings of Judah according to their degree of obedience to the Deuteronomistic law, especially regarding aspects of the purification of the cult and its concentration to one place, the temple in Jerusalem. Additional criteria in the Deuteronomistic worldview are Jerusalem and the house of David. The standing of Jerusalem is derivative of the ideology of the exclusivity of the cult and its concentration, since it is the place which Yahweh, your God, will choose to make his name dwell there, as is written in Deuteronomy 12, verse 11. This is also where the Deuteronomistic belief in the eternity of Jerusalem arose, since according to this concept, God chose Jerusalem, made his name dwell in the city, and protects it from its enemies. Therefore, Jerusalem was seen during the writing of Deuteronomy as the only legitimate center of cult to God, the God of Israel. The standing of the house of David results from the fact that in the city that God has chosen, only a king that God has chosen can rule. And the kings who were chosen to reign from Jerusalem are, of course, the kings of the house of David, to whom the promise of eternal rule in Jerusalem was given, as already defined in the speech in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 to 16. When your days are fulfilled and you lay down with your fathers, I will raise up your offsprings after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. When he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took from Saul, whom I put away from before you, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. The Deuteronomist explained the long-term survival of the kingdom of Judah through the idea of eternal promise to the house of David, and set David as an example and model for all the kings who succeeded him, since all the kings are assessed in his light. The Deuteronomist authoring editor's attitude towards the kings of Judah is revealed by the fact that they were all evaluated according to their degree of obedience to the Deuteronomistic law, especially in terms of the exclusivity and concentration of the cult. At the core of the Deuteronomist's historical conception are Jerusalem and the house of David, which had received God's eternal grace. The notion allowed these historiographers to explain the long history of the kingdom of Judah as opposed to the shorter one of the kingdom of Israel. And what about the kings of Israel who were not from the house of David and didn't rule from Jerusalem? The focal point for the description of the reigns of all the kings of Israel seems to be the cultic arrangements set by Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, the first king of the northern kingdom who reigned there after the division of the monarchy. According to the description in the first book of Kings, chapter 11, verse 38, Jeroboam was promised, even before the division of Solomon's kingdom, a conditional possibility of an eternal promise, like the one given to David. I'm quoting, "And it shall be, if you will hearken to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes by keeping the statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you, and will build you a sure house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you." However, after the division of the kingdom, Jeroboam made cultic and religious reforms which contradicted the concept of centralization of the cult in Jerusalem. And I can read from first book of Kings, chapter 12, verses 26 to 30. "And Jeroboam said in his heart, Now the kingdom will return back to the house of David, if these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem. Then the heart of these people will turn again to the Lord, to Rehoboam king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam king of Judah." So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and he said to the people, "You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan, and this thing became a sin. This means that Jeroboam's main, if not only sin, involved worshipping God in altars and temples that are not Jerusalem. This means that Jeroboam's main, if not only sin, involved worshipping God in altars and temples that are not in Jerusalem. Notably, this is not a matter of idolatry or any other cultic sins. It is only about worshipping God, the God of Israel, outside of the place God has chosen according to the laws of the book of Deuteronomy. In light of this, immediately after the description of Jeroboam's cultic reforms, a Deuteronomistic prophecy is given, and this is in the first book of Kings, chapter 13, verse 1 to 3. "And behold, a man of God came out of Judah by the word of Yahweh to Bethel. Jeroboam was standing by the altar to burn incense, and the man cried again the altar by the word of Yahweh and said, O altar, altar, thus said Yahweh, Behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name. And he shall sacrifice upon you the priests of the high places who burn incense upon you, and man's bone shall be burned upon you. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, This is the sign that Yahweh has spoken. Behold, the altar shall be torn down, and the ashes that are upon it shall be poured out." In this way, Jeroboam was tied to Josiah, and the establishment of the temple in Bethel, which was the main, most important temple of the kingdom of Israel, was tied to its destruction and impurity in the days of Josiah, which is described as part of Josiah's cultic reform in the second book of Kings, chapter 23, verses 15 to 20. This event ends the cycle that began in the days of Jeroboam. I'm quoting, "Moreover, the altar at Bethel, the high place erected by Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, that altar with the high place he pulled down, and he broke in pieces its stones, crushing them to dust. Also he burned the Asherah. And as Josiah turned, he saw the tombs there on the mount. And he sent and took the bones out of the tombs and burned them upon the altar and defiled it, according to the words of Yahweh, which the man of God proclaimed, who had predicted these things. Then he said, "What is yonder monument that I see?" And the man of the city told him, "It is the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah and predicted these things which you have done against the altar at Bethel." And he said, "Let him be. Let no man move his bones." So they let his bones alone with the bones of the prophet who came out of Samaria, and all the shrines also of the high places that were in the cities of Samaria, which kings of Israel had made, provoking Yahweh to anger, Josiah removed. He did to them according to all that he had done at Bethel. And he slew all the priests of the high places who were there upon the altars, and burned the bones of men upon them. Then he turned to Jerusalem. Between Jeroboam and Josiah, between the building of the temple in Bethel and its destruction, between the prophecy about Josiah in the days of Jeroboam and its fulfillment in the days of the cultic reform, lies the original scene of all the kings of Israel who followed the path of Jeroboam and continued to worship the God of Israel in the temples that Jeroboam built. This is the opening formula for each of the kings of Israel and the theological judgment for all these kings, who couldn't escape it, since the kingdom of Israel was destroyed about 100 years before the days of Josiah, and none of the kings of Israel knew the Deuteronomistic ideology. They didn't know that they were sinnings. Only the destruction of Israel and the Deuteronomistic explanation given for the destruction led to this historical understanding, which stands at the heart of the Deuteronomists' worldview, characterizes their time, and present the criterion by which they judged all the kings of Israel. Therefore, already in the opening formula for each of the kings of Israel, they are judged severely, regardless of their dynasty or actions. Thus, for example, First Book of Kings, chapter 15, verse 26, states about Nadav, the son of Jeroboam. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and walked in the way of his father, and in his sin which he made Israel to sin. Of Baasha, the son of Achiah, who destroyed the dynasty of Jeroboam, it is written in the first book of Kings, chapter 15, verse 34, that he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, and walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin which he made Israel to sin. And even Yehu, who according to the second book of Kings, chapter 10, verse 28, thus Yehu wiped out the Baal from Israel. The opening formula still adds, but Yehu didn't turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, the golden calves that were in Bethel and in Dan. This, from the Deuteronomistic perspective, is also the reason for the final destruction of the kingdom of Israel, as described in the second book of Kings, chapter 17, verses 21 to 23. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. And Jeroboam drove Israel from following Yahweh and made them commit great sin. The people of Israel walked in all the sins which Jeroboam did. They didn't depart from them until Yahweh removed Israel out of his sight, as he had spoken by all his servants the prophets. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. This means that all the kings of Israel are sinners because they broke away from two exclusive Deuteronomistic truths: the house of David, and the temple in Jerusalem. This judgment is understood to be retrospective, since throughout the years of their existence, the centers of cult to the God of Israel in Bethel and Dan had the same legitimacy as the temple in Jerusalem. Only about a century after the destruction of Israel were they used as a Deuteronomistic explanation for the destruction of Israel, or, in practice, for the question of why Israel was destroyed while Judah and Jerusalem were spared. A conclusion from this understanding of the description of the events in the Book of Kings is that the Deuteronomists describe the histories of the kings, judge them, and through their religious cultic behavior explained a political and social historical evolution. The king were assessed retrospectively according to the law of the Deuteronomistic worship, the exclusivity of the cult to the God of Israel, and the concentration of that cult in Jerusalem. According to these standards, all the kings of Israel were defined as sinners, and therefore the kingdom was destroyed. The Deuteronomists showed more mercy to the kings of Judah. Hence, only some of them are sinners, those to whom foreign cult was attributed, and all the rest, with the exception of Hezekiah and Josiah, are kings who did not sin but did fail to understand that the cult should be concentrated in Jerusalem. Despite this, the kings of the house of David and their capital, Jerusalem, all received eternal divine protection, a testimony to the time of the compilation of the historical accounts, to the optimism that existed in Jerusalem in the days of Josiah, and to the hopes that existed at that time and which were also expressed in the cultic reform and the concentration of the cult to the one temple in Jerusalem, as well as in the historical writing and the summary of the history of Israel and Judah. In this point, we should complete the introduction to the Book of Kings, continuing our review of the introductory chapters. Notably, shortly after the writing of the Book of Kings, and after the Deuteronomistic description became such a central and important part of the Jerusalem consciousness, the Babylonian destruction came about and Jerusalem itself was destroyed. Its population went into exile, and the house of David disappeared and never returned its standing in Jerusalem. The second Deuteronomistic edict took place during the exile, after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and the fall of the house of David undermined all the Deuteronomistic assumptions, requiring a new edit of the Book of Kings. This editing was done by the second Deuteronomist, the DTR2, who worked in Babylon, and it amended the Deuteronomistic history from the time of Josiah on three main levels. First, it corrected the eternal promise, turning it into a conditional one, as evidenced, for example, by the text in the first book of Kings, chapter 8, verse 25, which includes the conditional sentence, in Hebrew, rak im, in English, if only, the same as was added to all the places where the promise of eternity is mentioned. I'm quoting, "Now therefore, Yahweh, God of Israel, keep with thee servant David, my father, what you have promised him, saying, there shall never fail you a man before me to sit upon the throne of Israel, if only your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me as you have walked before me." Second, the editing from the days of the exile updated the history and added the description covering the days of Josiah through the destruction. Second book of Kings, chapter 24 and 25. These chapters describe the history as an inevitable deterioration into the final destruction, when all the last four kings of Judah after Josiah were judged harshly. They did what was evil in the eyes of God. In addition to these two emendations of the early Deuteronomistic text, the editing from the days of the exile also marked the blame for the destruction of Jerusalem, with the aim of answering the question of why the destruction came about, and if Josiah carried out a comprehensive cultic reform and centralized the cult in Jerusalem, how is that Judah was destroyed in the end? The Deuteronomistic explanation, which is based on the concept of ancestral sin, was that God decided to destroy Judah even before the days of Josiah, and that King Josiah's corrections failed to change God's decision. The blame was placed on the last sinful king before Josiah, his grandfather, King Manasseh, who had all the descriptions regarding his actions and the days of his reign erased, and all that is left of him is description of his sins and his guilt in the destruction of Jerusalem. This is in 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 21, and I can read from verses 10 to 14. And Yahweh said by his servants the prophets, because Manasseh, king of Judah, had committed these abominations, and has done things more wicked than all the Amorites did, who were before him, and has made Judah also to sin with his idols. Therefore, thus said Yahweh, the God of Israel, behold, I am bringing upon Jerusalem and Judah such evil that the ears of every one who hears of it will tingle, and I will stretch over Jerusalem the measuring line of Samaria, and the plummet of the house of Ahab, and I will wipe Jerusalem as one wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. And I will cast off the remnant of the heritage and given them into the hand of their enemies, and they shall become a prey and a spoil to all their enemies. From the way in which history was shaped, it appears that even Josiah's reform was unable to settle God's anger and prevent the destruction. This is how the history of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah was shaped by the Deuteronomists. And the question that can be asked now is, what did the Deuteronomistic authoring editors know about the historical reality that they described in their composition? What were their sources? If the Book of Kings was written and edited for the first time at the end of the 7th century BCE at the earliest, what did the Deuteronomists know about the events that took place 1, 2, or 3 centuries before their time? By analyzing the information in the Book of Kings and comparing it to external sources, we can conclude that the outline of the Book of Kings is based on lists of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, which included most of the information presented in the opening and closing formulae. Similar lists are known from other kingdoms in the ancient Near East, and even for the synchronism between the kings of Judah and Israel, parallels can be found in synchronistic compositions of the king of Babylon and Assyria, evidence of the perception of a special connection between the two kingdoms. In any case, it seems that the synchronistic description in the Book of Kings is the outcome of the Deuteronomist calculation alongside an extension of their worldview regarding the primordial unity of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The repeated references in the closing formulae regarding almost all the kings imply that they contain additional information. The Book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel and the Book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah. The references to this source in the king's closing formulae repeat almost identically. For example, in the closing formula of King Omri in First Book of Kings, chapter 16, verse 27. Now, the rest of the acts of Omri which he did, and the might that he showed, are they not written in the Book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Some researchers speculated that the Deuteronomists had a pre-Deuteronomistic book on the history of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, but it is difficult for me to accept the existence of a detailed pre-Deuteronomistic chronicle which also contained additional information beyond what was included in the books of Kings. I consider it reasonable to assume that, at most, information was added to the list of kings, not necessarily in the form of a narrative book. The quotation formula is used as a literary mechanism through which the Deuteronomists show that they based their writings on archival lists and explicitly offer their readers that the very little information about most of the kings and about most of the history is intended to support and strengthen their ideological line and is not to be considered all the information that exists about the histories of the two kingdoms and their kings. An additional key source used by the Deuteronomistic historiographers is prophetical stories. Indeed, the Book of Kings contains cycles of stories of prophets, including the stories about Achiah the Shilonite in First Book of Kings, chapters 11 to 14, Elijah in the First Book of Kings 17 to 21, and Elijah from the Second Book of Kings, chapter 1 to 9, as well as several other anonymous prophets whose names are unknown, for example in the First Book of Kings, chapter 20 and 22. Notably, the stories of the prophets were not written as official history. At their core is a description of the life of the prophets, their companions, and their work on social and religious level. The stories of the prophets have a legendary character, and they include local and not national miracle stories. They were apparently composed by groups of admirers who wanted to preserve the memory of a legendary prophet in the generations after their lifetime, and after being handed down orally, they were put into writings on scrolls handed down from generation to generation. These stories came into the hands of the Deuteronomists, who learned through them about ancient history, mainly of the kingdom of Israel, and incorporated them into their composition as they found and read them. As we will see later, apart from the stories of the prophets, the Deuteronomists seem to have had almost no other sources about the earlier periods of Judah and especially of Israel. Therefore, most of the book of the first king describes the history of the king of Israel, but the description is limited to the stories of the prophets, as these stories were shaped through the cultic social notions of the Deuteronomists. In the next chapter, I will analyze the stories about the first kings of Israel, showing how they teach us that the historiographers had only limited information which came from the lists of kings they had available. Moreover, the historiographers were mainly tasked with the opening and closing formulae, in addition to limited information on the murders of kings, rebellions, and changes of dynasties. They integrated these descriptions into their general historical framework, and a later editor added to this description the prophecies that herald the end of the dynasty. These prophecies were planted such as to demonstrate and illustrate God's control over history through the literary means of the prophecy and its fulfillment, a note saying that God's words were fulfilled in accordance with the divine message. It was added after the fulfillment of each of the prophecies to link and connect the prophecy to its fulfillment. If the Deuteronomistic historiographers had any additional information about these kings, it stemmed from the information they had about the first kings who reigned in Judah during the area corresponding to the first kings in Israel. In continuation of this examination of the description of the days of the rich and powerful Omri dynasty, which established a kingdom of Israel as a large regional kingdom, testifies to the key importance of the stories of the prophets, from which the historiographers learned a lot about the days of Omri and especially about the days of Ahab. However, a critical look at the biblical descriptions indicates that they didn't always relate the prophetic stories to the correct historical places, and that the pictures they produced were not always accurate and reliable. It's going to be very interesting in the next chapters. See you.